The economy added 216,000 jobs in the month of March, beating estimates. Regardless, though, up till now, our next guest says the White House is not doing enough to bring down the unemployment rate, or Washington shameful that they're not using more tools to do so. President Obama's former chief economist, Christina Romer, says, quote, "If I have a complaint about policy these days, it's that we're not doing enough." Dr. Romer is now a Bloomberg contributing editor and a professor at UC Berkeley. She joins us early morning on the West Coast right now. What's your correct reaction to this morning's figures?
Certainly this was a very solid jobs report. I think you characterized it exactly right. We added a good number of private sector jobs, and the unemployment rate ticked down. So that certainly is, probably one of the stronger jobs reports that we've had in quite a while. So that's certainly all, I think, good news. I think the other side, though, we do have to keep in mind what that overall number is. And at 8.8%, that is still a very high and a very painful unemployment rate.
Yeah, within the numbers, we also saw, though, that average hourly earnings stayed the same, and the average work week stayed the same in terms of number of hours actually worked. So does that concern you?
The average hourly earnings, that one of the things that you learn from that, there's been a lot of talk about inflation recently, and would the rise in commodity prices start feeding through to wages? What this certainly shows is that that's not happening, and I think that is certainly important for this sense of we're not about to have a takeoff in inflation. And I think that's an important thing for people to realize.
Or perhaps so-called stagflation isn't the situation we're in.
Right. I think that's exactly right.
At the same time, when you look at these jobs that have been added, they're coming from the private sector. That's a good sign. But we are seeing more government jobs getting cut. At the very same time, there's debate in Washington about how to rein in the budget, which would presumably cut more jobs on that front. What are you forecasting in terms of public sector losses?
Well, no, what we saw this month was that we lost 15,000 jobs in local government. That's the main place where we lost jobs, and most of those were in education. And that certainly has to be concerning for anyone that cares about the future of the country, because those are teachers, those are education, and that's certainly a problem. I don't think, we haven't seen the worst of this yet. So I think we are going to keep seeing those state and local numbers continue to drop. And that is certainly hard on the recovery, but it's also very hard on state and local services like education.
So 8.8% unemployment is the best we're going to see near term. You think it's going to go up from here?
That I think is hard to tell. One of the things that I found striking, I went back and looked at the numbers, we've basically shaved a percentage point off the unemployment rate since October. And that's pretty surprising given that GDP growth really has not been very strong. It's really been at a level where you'd only have expected to shave off maybe a tenth or two. And so I think part of what we may be seeing is the flip side of what we saw in the run-up of unemployment, where it sometimes rose much more than you would have expected given GDP. One thing that may be happening is we're getting some of that back now, which would obviously be good news, and we'll have to wait and see. I think that means there's a lot of uncertainty about where the unemployment rate's going to go in the next several months.
When you said it's shameful that some of the tools at our disposal aren't being used in Washington to create jobs, what did you mean? What do you want done?
Well, one thing I did want to correct. So I was certainly not singling out the administration. I think the president has certainly in his State of the Union talked about some additional job measures that he wanted. I've certainly been a very strong in my discussion of the Federal Reserve. I think they're part of the policy-making mix that, we're in the middle of our second round of quantitative easing, but they've made it very clear that's going to stop in June. And I think that is potentially a mistake, that they ought to be thinking what more could they be doing, because 8.8% unemployment is still a tragedy. But there are other actions that we could take on the fiscal side. I've talked a lot about a payroll tax cut on the employer side. I think that's something that we didn't do in December. We did it on the employee side, but on the employer side might give you an extra jolt, and particularly on employment, because it would lower the cost of hiring a worker.
We're back in business with Christina Romer, President Obama's former chief economist. economist, currently a Bloomberg contributing editor. And Professor Romer, before the break, we were talking about what the Fed, in your view, could have done in terms of helping to build further momentum. Today, just this morning, Fed President of New York, Bill Dudley, said that he thinks this recovery is still tenuous. And in fact, he thinks we're going to feel more shocks from Japan and from the Middle East in terms of hurting growth. Are you expecting the Fed to continue beyond June with some sort of level of support with quantitative easing or perhaps even a QE3?
I think what President Dudley was saying, I think, is exactly right. I would have said for the last several months, we've been seeing a number of the indicators come in a little bit worse than expected. And so I think the idea that this recovery is somewhat tenuous, I think, is a important point to make. It actually is a big contrast with some of the other Federal Reserve Bank presidents who keep talking about it's a self-sustaining recovery. And, one of the things that bothers me is it may be self-sustaining, but it's at a pretty low rate of growth. So what we could expect, I don't have a lot of hope that the Fed is going to do another round of quantitative easing or extend this one. I think, a number of the voting members on the FOMC seem pretty dug in on exiting as expected in June. I hope that would change. I think there are other things as well. A communications policy could be helpful here. I think the market may be expecting the Fed to be raising the funds rate sooner than, certainly than I'm expecting. And so, maybe when Chairman Bernanke starts to have his press conference, we'll get a clearer sense of where, maybe the majority of the FOMC is actually headed.
When we saw mortgage-backed security support withdrawn by the Fed, we did see panic in the market start to creep up. What lesson was learned from that?
Well, I think one of the things that might have been learned is certainly given what's been going on in the housing market and given that the economy, does need additional support, going back to buying some MBS might be a very helpful thing to do.
We shall see. Thank you so much, Professor Romer, for making time today.